Hey, all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's a Friday, which is the day that we talk about economics. Not a Thursday, which is the day we talk about news. We talk about economics and science on Fridays around here. And boy, no better time to be talking about economics than in the middle of infrastructure, build back better arguments, and concern about inflation. So we're going to talk inflation. Now, you might say to yourself, boy, I love the podcast, but man, I don't know if I can handle a conversation about economics and inflation, on the holidays. We promise we'll make it fun. We'll be informative, entertaining, and inspiring. just like public radio in Indiana.
Yeah, that's right. That's the catchphrase for WVPE 88.1 NPR here in South Bend. So
is that are you a member? Is that your member station?
Yeah, that's my member station. I got the sticker to prove it.
Out of South Bend, Indiana. Well, KNOW is the station here. KNOW. No.
Yeah,
cute,
that's
KNOW. 91.1 here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I live, and then different numbers around the state. Our local public radio station, KNOW, is one of the 3 or 4 juggernauts in all of public radio. It was one of the first public radio stations. It's American Public Media comes out of here.
Yeah.
So all that stuff that's produced, they're one of the big players, competing even with NPR as programming. So if you sometimes hear, a show on public radio is brought to you by PRI, Public Radio International, or American Public Media, or NPR.
Yep.
These are all suppliers. Yeah, and I've been a member in the past. Not currently a donating member to my public radio station.
They finally got me with the spring membership drive, all the guilt tripping. It was like
it wasn't a
back in
park
church,
pass.
It
wasn't a park pass. It was, come on, man, you listen to this.
Yeah.
You should chip in. I mean, imagine if we started that. Hey, you.
Are you enjoying this?
You owe me.
You should pay.
You owe me money. What I don't get about how their model works. I mean, I love it that I love the notion of public funded radio. I think it's fantastic. I mean, that's basically what we do. We just have a very small public that funds our little radio broadcast around here. But we'd love for you to all be part of it. Go to votecommongood.com, make a donation today. I love that idea. But then they also run ads. Yeah. So I'm like, pick your lane here, friends. Like that in between the pledge drives of asking me to do my part, then you're running an ad that you call a sponsorship. So anyway, I've got my own little bones to pick, like in a game of Operation. But we're not talking about public radio's finances today. We're talking about
the nation's finances.
The nation's finances. Normally we have our economics professor, Fadhel Kaboub, on with us, and Fadhel is a professor of economics at Dyson University, but he's also a leading voice and a public voice in an understanding, a view of economics called MMT, modern monetary theory. The words modern and monetary and theory don't really matter. Just know that he's a part of what he refers to as an alternative way that economists think about how our economy works and what causes it to function, especially the role of government in it. And if you've listened to this podcast before, which we hope you have, but if you're new, go back and listen to our conversations with Professor Fadhel, because his take and explanation of what currency does in the United States, how it works, how it functions, and all this, that is gold. We have many a week. And you can almost, if you go through and watch these, go back and watch them. And if you got the family together here over the holidays, this is a great time. Gather them around your computer screen or cast it onto your television, and watch some old Friday episodes of the Common Good podcast with your family and friends. I can't imagine a more festive experience. But once you understand the arguments that Dr. Fadhel is making, that taxes in the United States do not fund the government. The government spending is funded by the government spending money into existence. the paradigm shift, the mental shift that you go through, I have compared it to the Copernican revolution, when people, in the 1500s had to recognize that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but that the Earth revolves around the sun. That shifted which is moving in relationship to the other. It's like that when he describes that tax dollars don't fund our government. The government makes money, produces out of the federal treasury. And when it spends it, then that money becomes part of the economy. And then people earn it, pay it. And when you pay taxes, that money then is taken out of the economy and is removed. So when you pay your taxes, you're saying, I'm going to pay you $100 in federal tax so that there's 100 less dollars in the economy now. It's your state government, your federal, your city government, your county government. When you pay your money to them, however, then they put the money into a bank account, and when they go to spend it, they keep spending your same money. So that same, if you were somehow to be able to track the money you had paid to your state, local, county government, that money would still be circulating around. Once you pay it to the federal government, it is removed from the economy. So what the federal government is doing is spending money into existence and then removing money through taxes. Fadhel and I have had a number of conversations about, should we even have taxes? Like, why? And he's like, yeah, we really do have to have them, because we do have to get money out of the economy, because the government has to keep spending. It's a better way than what local governments do. Federal government has to keep spending billions, trillions of dollars. So you have to take some money out. You can't just keep putting it in, or you end up with too much money, causing inflation, which is where we bring ourselves to today.
Yeah.
So that whole background is super important to understand Fadhel's perspective on what's actually happening in the world. Now, again, when economists talk about economic theory, it's like psychological theories as opposed to, say, religious theory. Religious theory is trying to say, when it's a theory in religion, is trying to say, I'm going to give you an explanation about what might be. Psychological theory, economic theory is saying, I have a theory to explain why things are the way they are. Right? So there's different kinds of theories that exist in our world, and they're all really good. Religious theory is good. Psychological theory is good. Economic theory is good. Sports theory is all good. But there's a difference between the kind that are like, here's the world I want to tell you about, that there's no provable way to exist, but you could believe it or have faith in, or something. God or prayer, how it works. Psychology and economics, though, you're like, hey, you're having a psychological experience. I have a theory to explain why that's happening, why you're feeling what you're feeling, experiencing what you're experiencing. And economics, they're not saying, here's an imaginary economy I would like to see exist. Here's my theory of an imaginary economy. What they're saying is, here's the economy. I have an explanation about how it works, and other people have an explanation about how it works, and we're going to debate those explanations. So when they use theory, it's not theoretical or imaginary or possible. It's explanatory.
A proposed explanation for how things work. Oh, hey.
Right. Did you hear that? That was my watch saying, I didn't get that. Could you try again? Quite literally, Siri must be listening and like, I didn't understand any of that analogy there.
Didn't quite get that, Doug. Try again.
I didn't even get it, and I'm an algorithm. I'm as dry as this conversation, and I didn't get it. All right. What were you saying there, Dan, before interrupted by my watch?
Oh, just, yeah,
Something
reiterate.
important?
It's an explanation, a proposed explanation for how things function.
I guess could have saved us 6 minutes right there. Proposed explanation about how things are done. Well said. All right. So Fadhel's talking about inflation, which is the thing that that the government worries about. I didn't know how much the economic and federal system worried about inflation until Fadhel started talking about it, and I started tuning my ear to what the Federal Reserve is doing, or why senators are saying we should spend this amount of money versus this amount of money. Sometimes people say federal government can't spend money because we don't have enough. We'd have to tax people to spend it. And people who understand how the system actually works wring their hands and pull their hair out. I don't know if you can do this at the same time, but they go, they go nutty because they're saying, look, we don't have to worry about how much money the government spends based on how much we're going to tax people. We can just leave that extra money in the economy. If we want to spend $1 trillion and not take $1 trillion out of the economy, leave it in there, then we don't have to tax people. We'll just leave it in there. Right. Um, that argument, how much should we spend and how much should we take out, is not because we don't have the money to pay for it. It's because it could cause inflation. So inflationary worries keep coming up. Joe Manchin talks about this all the time. He's worried that we're going to end up with inflation. During the pandemic spending, when $1 trillion, trillion plus dollars was being spent into the economy in cash, landing in people's bank accounts, there was great worry that that could overheat the economy, put too much money in, and cause inflation. Fadhel's going to get to all this in his explanation. So it's timely and important, and we want to talk about there, but it's also got this deep political sense, which is partly why we're talking about it here, so that you'll understand economics a little more fully, so that when you have to make a decision or be in a conversation about this in the political sense, you've got a little bit more to know about it.
Yeah.
So we wanted to have Fadhel on today, but we couldn't work it out. But I did find a video where he was on another live stream giving a presentation on inflation. And so we've pulled that video, and we're going to show that video and try to let him speak for himself. But there'll be some interruptions in there to sort of lay some context and do some explaining and raise some questions, to you. And ultimately we'll get to Professor Kaboub at some point. So here's the video, and it includes a PowerPoint. That's him on the screen, and we'll be in the corner, chit-chatting it up too. It's sort of mystery science theater version of economics with Fadhel Kaboub.
Here we go.
What is inflation? When we talk about inflation, we're talking about a persistent increase in the general price level over time. Typically in the US, we measure inflation month to month. So every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will release the new inflation numbers. But when economists talk about inflation, we usually compare year to year. So we're talking about the annual change from last year to this year. And when we talk about the general price level, we're talking about typically the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, in the US. Different countries have similar indices, but let's call it Consumer Price Index. And it's essentially a method that we use to look at the average family, say in the United States. What do we consume? A basket of items that the average family consumes, not the wealthiest family, not the poorest family, the average family. We buy groceries, we buy transportation, entertainment, clothing, you name it, all of these items. And the BLS will literally look at item by item, hundreds of items in this basket, and they'll look at actual prices associated with the gallon of milk, associated with a pound of rice or pasta, or whatever it is. And we'll get the average prices of the typical items that people buy from grocery stores. So we put a price tag on all of those items, and we create an index, sort of a weighted average. And that index is Consumer Price Index. And then we compare it month to month, year to year. If the index is increasing, we call that inflation. If the index is decreasing month to month or year to year, we call that deflation, which is the opposite of inflation. And I'll come back to deflation in a moment, because a lot of people kind of intuitively, from an individual perspective, you would think, well, we don't want inflation. Why would we want prices to go up? Maybe we do want deflation. And deflation, I can tell you right now, is the most dangerous thing for the economy. And I'll come back and I'll explain why. There's two types of inflation
that Consumer Price Index. There are literally shoppers every month who go around to grocery stores with the CPI list and chronicle. Now I'm sure I'm doing it like with a pen in my hand, which maybe they still do. They probably punch it into a phone or to an iPad, and they literally go shopping. There's people, this is their job, to go all over the country, different regions of the country, and shop for these things and to get the actual dollar amount of what consumers are buying. And there's a set list, as Fadhel said, that's determined, and a lot of argument about what goes on that list, about what should be included or not. So sometimes you'll hear them say, Consumer Price Index has gone up, but it doesn't include gas or it doesn't include groceries, this new number that they're looking at, because sometimes in some industries there's little bubbles of things that happen, and they keep those they sometimes keep those in or sometimes take those out. So I just think it's kind of fascinating that we have people at the federal government level that are going around shopping the federal putting price shoppers and determining what the dollar amount is. But even that determination about what do you consider to be the indicators that would tell you how much does it cost for an average person to live is really kind of fascinating.
Yeah, they're literally going shop. You can't just like look online and see what.
No, they literally go shopping. They walk into grocery stores and they rotate the grocery stores. And there's a lot of debate about which grocery store do you go to, right? Do you go to Hy-Vee? Do you go to Aldi? Do you go to Kroger? Do you go to in our area, we have some more higher end grocery stores. Which ones do you go to determine the price of a can of beans? And then they have a way to determine that. Because when you're talking about inflation, you're talking about a 1%, 2%, 3%, 6%. Well, to get to that number, that's going to include like how much was a can of beans. And if a can of beans was $1, now our Price is Right. If a can of beans was on $1.19 a year ago and it's $1.22 now, well, that's gone up 3 cents, which is a lot on a $1.19 product. Right. So so these little movements. So the price between grocery stores can make a determination. Right. So all of these little factors, and the reason I think this is important is because the art that goes into inflation determination, not just the science, really matters. What products, how much, what days, do you include coupons or not? What about stores that raise their prices higher for people that are not part of their little club? If you don't have your phone number in there and you get a reduction on certain other products, and are those included? All of this is what goes into determining whether inflation is something we should be concerned about or not. Again, because the percentages are so small. 1%, 2%. Like if you had 6% increase in the price of something, well, if that's a car that you're buying, that's a lot. But if it's a gallon of milk, you may not even notice when you grab that gallon of milk that it was $2 or $4.19 and now it's $4.39. You might not notice that, or even remember how much it was. Mm-hmm. Like if you ask me how much a gallon of milk is, I don't know. Not because I don't buy milk, but because I don't actually look at the price of it. I look at the brand and the fat count, the percentage of fat. I don't look at the price every single time I go shopping. So I have no idea if I've spent more or not. I just get to the end and I think, wow, that bill is higher than I thought it was going to be. Or I can look, and see how much we spent on groceries in some other month. But then I'm not even sure, was that because I bought different things or were things just more expensive? And this is what happens in inflation, that these real numbers are what people really are looking at to determine this. They're not ballparking this. Mm-hmm. They are doing actual, real, legitimate numbers of what it actually costs somebody as one of the indicators of the consumer price index for determining inflation.
Yeah.
Economists talk about that we should be aware of and kind of distinguish the sources of inflation. There is the so-called demand pull inflation, which is the idea that the economy is generating too much demand for consumer goods. In other words, consumers have a lot of money. Maybe labor unions are too strong and they have strong wages, so they have a lot of money and they go out on a shopping spree and they buy a lot of stuff. They add to the demand, and the supply side of the economy is just not able to keep up. So it causes inflation, causes prices to go up. So that's demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation, as the name indicates, is the type of inflation where prices go up because the cost of doing business is actually increasing. That could be, for example, an increase in oil prices, because oil is a basic input in pretty much everything we do, at least have been doing for a long time. Cost of energy, shipping, transportation, heating and cooling, petrochemicals, all the things that you see around you on your desk in your house probably have paint on them and petrochemicals. So when the price of oil increases, the price of all of those inputs that go into production and shipping and heating and cooling, all of those prices go up. So the cost goes up, it causes inflation. So that's a classic case of cost push inflation. So these are two things that we need to distinguish. So when we talk about today's inflation, we need to be very careful Do we blame workers for having too much money and causing inflation, as in demand pull inflation, which is typically what some analysts would blame consumers for having too much money, or maybe blame the government for subsidizing the unemployed during the pandemic with too much money, right? Giving them unemployment benefits and sending them on a shopping spree to cause inflation. Now, sounds familiar. You've probably heard a lot of this in the last few months in the US with calls on the government to reduce and eliminate the unemployment benefits because they're perceived as, number one, causing this massive increase in consumer demand because the government is subsidizing the unemployed, basically. Number two, it's giving an incentive for the unemployed, those who are displaced by the COVID crisis, not to go back to low-paying jobs because the government is paying them $15 an hour, essentially. So I'm sure you've heard this narrative. Versus the cost push inflation narrative, which is there's been a major disruption in the supply chains for basic inputs, right? So it's not just the cost of shipping and the cost of oil, it's the microchips that go into all the consumer electronics that we buy, including industrial equipment, including the cars, the refrigerators, the laptops that we buy, the cell phones that we buy. So when you have a major supply chain disruption because of the pandemic, obviously over the last year, you create shortages of actual physical inputs. And as a result, prices go up, and that trickles through the entire system and creates delays, creates price increases and shortages in actual consumer goods as well, which helps to continue pushing those prices. Now, over the last year in the US, over the last few months, I should say, as the inflation rate started to spike, as the economy reopened in the last few months, a lot of people turned their attention immediately to the government subsidies, saying this is what's causing the inflation. Too much government spending, too much government deficit, too much in forms of subsidies to people who have been displaced by COVID. But many of us, and myself included, are paying close attention to the disruption in the supply chain. And when people say, is this a permanent cycle of inflation or is it transitory? This is the distinction that will help us identify which is it. So the mainstream approach to inflation that is traditionally for the
comment there about what he's getting at there, because it's really important. Fadhel is in addition to sort of making a definition of inflation and what causes it and how do people think about it, he's commenting. And it gets subtle where his comments come in, where he said some people are saying that our current inflation concerns are because the government's put too much money in through the spending. He is somebody who's going to say in a few minutes here, he doesn't think that we're anywhere close to there being too much money in our economy. He believes that's not the cause of inflation. Maybe you heard it and I sound redundant, but just to punctuate his point, he doesn't think the problem is that we've put $1 trillion into the economy or that talk of future spending from the government is a problem. He thinks there's a whole lot of room for a whole lot more money to go into the economy without any money coming out. In other words, if you think about it as a swimming pool, that you put money into the pool, right? Or sorry, you put water into the pool, and then when you get out of the pool, that's awesome. That's a great image, isn't it? That when you get out of the pool, or a duck gets out of the pool, you carry some water out with you, and then it evaporates, right? That's kind of how the economy. That's what taxes are: is you getting out of the pool, carrying your wet body, and it towels off, and it evaporates in the air, and it's gone. It's no longer in the pool and being cycled back to the pool. Fadhel would say, "Look, our pool, this 55,000 gallon swimming pool that we have here." This thing could take another 20,000 gallons. I mean, these are my numbers, right? He's just like, there's a lot more room for spending. Other people, the argument of inflation is, no, that pool is full. And every time we spend more money from the government, it's overflowing. And when it's overflowing, that's inflation. And Fadhel's like, no, there's plenty of room in the pool. Then people are like, well, then why is inflation happening? He's saying it's happening because the conditions of producing products is having a problem. Supply chain, there's not enough product. Things are hard to come by. Things have gotten expensive because workers can't be gotten. It's all conditional on the pandemic and a global slowdown. not on the United States government putting too much money in the system. This is sort of like the debate between the demand pull and the cost push people is pretty severe. So Fadhel is on the cost push. Now he would say, I'm sure, and he has said to, on this podcast, he said, look, yeah, the demand is relational to the amount of product that's available for sure. They're not totally separate, but one is a cause and one is an effect. And he's trying to say the problem is not that there's too much money in there. He's defending government spending. What he's going to do even more aggressively here, and it's good that you see, I think it's good for you to see that this is coming. He's defending government spending and he's defending government regulation of monopolies, because he's about to say the condition that creates cost push inflation is bad behavior by industries that are monopolizing, running up prices, acting unfairly in the market.
Yeah, and the lack of choice for the average consumer.
Yeah, he would say choice is the heart of it. That's right. That's right. Okay, so this thing here, this is what inflation is, that it's real money in real dollars spent by real people and all of this. And it's the cause of inflation is either that there's too much money, so then people are like, I'll spend more money on this thing because I have it, I can spend it, and then the demand in a system like ours is that, hey, a lot of people want to buy a snow cone. Last year we charged $3 for our snow cone. Maybe this year we should charge $3.25 for our snow cone, because people want the snow cone so much and they can afford it. We'll raise the price significantly, and that could cause inflation, right? That's the big argument. Which one is causing it? The other thing that goes on here, which is super important on the cost push side, and I think we're in a cost push inflation system. I don't think it's because there's too much money in the country. I think that products are hard to come by, and we have lots of disruptions. But that takes a long time to get all the way through the system. Here's what I mean. When you look at the consumer price index, some products at our stores function like gasoline prices, where they're adjusted daily. And some products that you buy at a grocery store, that price is set by the company that sells it. So when General Mills sells a box of cereal, they determine how much they're going to sell it for to a grocery store. They're not changing that every day like gas prices or milk prices are changing every day. That's not how General Mills or Kellogg's works. They can't possibly, be every day adjusting prices. So what they'll do is quarter by quarter, they'll make adjustments in pricing. Or sometimes they'll put it out for 3 quarters and they'll say a price increase is coming in cereal. Or they will say, we're not going to increase the price in cereal. We're going to decrease the amount of cereal in the box. So they'll go from 12.3 ounces to 12 ounces and sell it for the same price. Now, this is what the consumer price index also has to take into account, right? They can't just grab that can of beans or that box of cereal and say, how much was it? They then have to look and say, how much is it per ounce, right? So when Kellogg's or General Mills decides to raise the price of cereal, it rumbles through the economy. They need to give all kinds of warning. So much stuff has to change in the system for this to happen, right? So by the time they change their pricing based on conditions in the summer, they may not raise their pricing until next spring. This is what causes inflation delay. And that's the reason that we don't know all the time what's causing the inflation. Right? Those of us who are just average observers of this. This is why you need scientists and spreadsheets and algorithms looking at this stuff and saying, oh, you know what's causing inflation right now in December of 2021 in the Christmas season? It was last summer or last Christmas.
Right.
That's what
supply chain, microchips, whatever.
Could be a year back, or decisions were made a year ago to raise prices 9 months from now. So now prices were raised because they're trying to make up for losses last quarter, last year, last budget cycle. So economies are super complicated like this. Some prices are moving every day. Some prices are moving in the middle of the day. For whatever reason, gas prices get to move at whatever time. You're like, go in the morning and it can be one price. And I know people that like shop for gas prices and they have an app that's looking hour by hour for where the gas prices are shifting. amazing. Like it's just making
Seems
changes
like a lot of work for just a couple pennies.
to save a couple pennies. But you know what? People that are penny wise, they're not always pound foolish. So that's why they do it, because a penny saved is a penny earned.
That's right.
I think all those phrases are from when a penny was actually like worth more than a penny.
Could
But
buy a whole
okay,
candy.
so this is a big deal, right? On like, how do we even understand what's causing inflation or not? Now, Fadhel's going to get in some of the more politically poignant moments of all of this.
That will help us identify which is it. So the mainstream approach to inflation, that is traditionally for the last several decades, since the 1970s, the mainstream economist will tell you too much government spending will cause inflation, right? Whether it's government subsidies or government contracts, you're just flooding the system with cash, giving people dollars to go out and shop and increase demand way beyond the capacity of the economy to keep up with it. So that causes inflation. Large government deficits. So you have a lot of deficit hawks, right, who oppose the idea of government deficits. And we hear quite a bit from them today, including especially Senator Manchin in the US, who's I guess the one person right now standing in the way of the Biden agenda for the big infrastructure spending. High levels of national debt. People say we're going broke, we can't continue to borrow, and so on. So they argue the best way to avoid this too much money chasing too few goods in the system, and to avoid having central banks pursue this quantitative easing policies, which most central banks have used since 2008, that is expanding the quantity of money, especially for the banking system, and bailing out the financial system, keeping interest rates very low for banks and for consumers. That just encourages more spending, which means ultimately it's going to lead to an inflation cycle. But all of this has been happening since 2008, and not a single kind of hint of inflation was appearing, right? All major central banks were trying actually to achieve an inflation of 2%, and yet none of it was happening. Here's a member of the Fed. This is from a couple of years ago. This is pre-pandemic, essentially admitting that for 10 years after 2008, we've tried everything to target inflation at 2%, and we just realized that we have no reliable theory of inflation. Translation in plain English, we have no idea what causes inflation. This is the mainstream essentially accepting this. So I'd like to introduce you very briefly.
Let's pause there for a second and just sort of say it again, because it comes fast from Fadhel. His argument is that the mainstream economists say it's all demand pull influences, right? It's all too much money. The amount of money creates too much demand that causes prices to go up. That's where it comes from. And then the government overspending. So the solution then to inflation is stop government spending. Most Democrats have been iffy on this. Most Republicans have gone along with it. And generally speaking, in our government and society, people have said, yeah, if the government spends money or we have too much debt, and again, debt in the government language is the difference between the amount of water that goes into the pool versus the amount of water that comes out of the pool. It's not debt like a city has, state has, or you and I have in our own budgets. It's the difference between spending and taxes, not the difference between how much we owe in debt. They call it a debt because it's the difference in the number, and not it's something that you actually owe money on. When we sell a bond or something else and we owe people interest rates, and therefore the federal government has something that they're going to pay back people, they've planned for that as government spend. They basically just said, hey, let us take some of your money out of the system now and we'll give you a little more money later. They're just arranging the timing of taking money out. So bond buying, you'll hear this is going on right now. The Fed just made an announcement yesterday, 2 days ago, that they're going to stop buying bonds back. They're going to stop paying people what they have for the money that they're owed, because they're deciding how much of that, how much water should be coming out of that hose going into the pool. And one of the ways they do it is not just through taxes, it's also through bonds that they buy and that they buy back, and that treasuries that they sell, which is a little deal with someone to say, take your money out now, we'll take it and get rid of it, and then we'll pay you back more later because we're adjusting the amount of water that's going in the pool, and we want to do it through ways that aren't only taxes. That's all that stuff that's going on. And what people are saying is the government has too much money in the system. That phrase down there, quantitative easing policies, that was a big thing in 2008 during the financial crisis when the banks were collapsing. The Federal Reserve said, oh, we're going to solve this problem through quantitative easing, which sounds like a very sophisticated notion, like almost quantum physics, like we're going to ease the quanta. It just means the quantity. So what they're saying is when
we're going to move a decimal and make more money.
Yeah. When they say quantitative easing, they're saying we're just going to give you more. It would be like somebody at the dinner table saying, "Hey, I'm still hungry," and then your mom says, "Would you like me to do some quantitative easing of the mashed potatoes?" Meaning, do you want more mashed potatoes? Should I give you a bigger scoop? That's all it is. Now, it's complicated how they do it, but this is an economics problem. They use phrases like this, right? Quantitative easing policies, meaning how do we put more money into the economy so that the economy doesn't run out of money? Because running out of money is a real problem. Having too much money may or may not at some point be a problem, but not enough money in the system. Like you look at countries where they've gone into real struggle, like Afghanistan right now, they're running out of money because no one will lend them money. Their banks have gone insolvent. The international community has stopped giving them and lending them money. They've seized up their bank accounts. So there's no money. That's a serious problem. Quantitative easing is putting more money in. Now, Fadhel is saying something here. What he's saying is the critique of inflation and the blame for inflation has been too much government spending. His opinion, I happen to hold this one now as well, is that's not what causes inflation in our economy. What causes inflation in our economy is the other side of the equation, the product side, not the demand side. At least we're nowhere close to it and probably won't be anytime soon. Even with billions and trillions of dollars of more spending, our economy can totally handle it. But what he's setting up here is a mainstream approach which says limit how much the government spends, and now he's going to provide an alternative answer to how we should be dealing with inflation that's not only general but it's also specific to where we are right now.
The approach, modern monetary theory, which is a framework that I belong to, and I'm happy to during the Q&A to tell you more about it. I'm just giving you just the inflation angle to this. So the mainstream believes that government spending, too much government spending causes inflation. So they believe government spending should be limited to how much the government can tax and how much the government can borrow from the private sector. Beyond that, they say, if we increase borrowing, if we increase deficit beyond reasonable limits, we're going to end up in cycles of inflation. And what MMT is saying that governments, sovereign governments like the United States government, actually have a much, much larger spending capacity.
So there it is.
Additional spending capacity is not infinite. It's constrained by the risk of inflation. And then the focus becomes what actually determines that risk of inflation. And to me, it's two particular items. The risk of inflation is constrained or triggered by the lack of productive capacity. In other words, if we have supply chain disruptions, if we run out of skilled workers, if we run out of raw materials, machinery, equipment, then yeah, if there's more demand for cars and computers and we have shortages, prices are going to go up. The good news about that type of inflation is that with a more resilient supply chain system, with more strategic investments and strategic planning for building productive capacity in the form of skills and technologies and machinery and equipment, we can actually create millions of jobs and at the same time expand the productive capacity, which means we actually tame the risk of inflation and we push that red bar further and further out. And as a result, increase that additional spending capacity of the federal government. And we've seen this in the beginning of the pandemic when everybody thought, where is the money coming from to pay for the pandemic relief money? Did we tax anybody? Did we borrow from anybody? Absolutely not. This was the sovereign government of the United States spending money into existence. And it didn't cause inflation per se. The inflation came from the disruptions in the supply chain, which I believe should be and can be transitory if we handle the pandemic the correct way, not just in the US, but globally, right? So this is a global situation. The second source of inflation, which is
he used a word there called transitory. That means temporary, meaning it's not nothing permanent. It's just a thing that's happening because of a set of conditions that are going to change. There was a comment by the Federal Reserve Chairman 2 days ago, and he had a press meeting and went through the whole thing and talked and answered questions. And after it, the reporters noted that the Fed chairman stopped using the phrase transitory inflation. He's not using that anymore. He was previously. He was saying this is transitory, or what normal people would call temporary. This is just right now. It's just It's like Christmas trees are expensive right now because we're getting closer to Christmas and there's not as many of them. That's going to go away, at the start of next Christmas season, and the prices will come back down. Nothing permanent with Christmas trees. It's just a supply demand problem right now, and it'll go away. It's kind of saying that about the whole economy, right? A set of conditions are in place. This is what Biden came out and said last week. But then just in the latter part of this week, the federal chairman stopped using that word. And you might know that people hang on what these people say and the words they use and the sentence structure and the order in which they say them. I mean, they are just, it's there. You would think
the stock market reacts to these little signals and codes from the Fed.
It's like a combination of an NFL quarterback press conference and how the reporters are hanging on every word that the quarterback is going to say, and a QAnon meeting where everything is hidden in code and trickery and nothing means what you think it means. And, oh, did you notice that he said something about demand inflation before he said something about conditional inflation? So therefore we can, like, oh my gosh, there is an entire industry that moves trillions of dollars around based on what these guys say. All of that to say it's important what they say. And he didn't say transitory. So I would love to talk to Fadhel, because this presentation Fadhel did here was from September 17th of this year. And now we're at, December 17th. So in these 3 months, I just wonder what his thinking is on the transitory nature, the temporary nature of where inflation is right now. The other thing I think it's important to wonder about here is Fadhel's making a big point by putting up, if you're only listening on the podcast, you can't see this, but he has a bar graph that has taxes in green, borrowing in purple, and says most mainstream economists think that inflation will happen if any spending goes beyond taxes and borrowing. And again, borrowing is a different term at the federal government. Borrowing means we'll take your money out now through a bond or through a treasury, and then we'll give you back a little bit more later. And they call that borrow. We're going to borrow the money from you now so that it comes out of the economy, so we can ease up so we can put some more money in. Then we'll just pay you back with interest later. And they call that borrowing. So those are the two places. We can take your money out compulsory through taxes, or we can reward you by giving you a little bit more money later. And they call one taxes and the other one borrowing. Just, it's pretty simple. I don't think borrowing is the right word there, but anyway, they call it borrowing. But then Fadhel says, but there's additional spending capacity. He puts that in yellow and says, inflation doesn't come on the demand side, until we've put all the money in through taxes, all the money we could through borrowing, and then all the money that we could through the extra space that's still there. And he's arguing there's a lot before we ever get to inflation. Now, here's the question that I have for him. And he even says, we could increase the capacity of federal spending. Why does he want to do that? Right? Why increase? Why all of this conversation? Why are they even having this argument about what's causing inflation? Like, is it more government spending or not? It's not just to solve the problem for Fadhel. He is actually saying we can and should increase the amount of federal spending. Now, a lot of people have only heard, because we mostly only hear about economics from conservatives, have only heard the federal government has to spend less. I mean, I'm 55 years old. I've heard a drumbeat of that song for 54 of my 55 years. The first year I wasn't really paying attention. No, 55 years of my life, it's been government spends less, government should spend less, government should spend less, government should spend less. Then Fadhel comes along and says, no, the government should spend more. The government should spend more. The government should spend more. And you're like, what? Who's this guy? And all the people like him who are saying spend more when everybody else is saying less. In other words, why is he arguing that there is an increased capacity of federal spending?
Yeah, I wonder if it
Why
has
does
to
he-
do with the government creating more capacity through spending. Take childcare for an example. It's expensive because there's not enough childcare workers, because it's a low-paying job in most cases. If the government would subsidize childcare, it would pay people more to take care of children, and it would free up the average worker to pay less for their childcare, which is a huge expense. And it seems like it creates the capacity that wouldn't cause inflation. It would actually help a lot of people.
I think that's exactly it. And I think Fadl's argument would be it is, like you say, spending in specific places in order to redistribute the money in the economy. For him, I think this is why I support the idea. I think he does it for the same reason, is because it allows us then to target with more additional government spending where money exists in our economy. Like, we know that money doesn't exist evenly in the economy. Take rural America and farmers. We know that there's not enough money in rural America for people to live the kind of lives they want to live and have thriving small towns. The price of corn and soybeans and sugar beets and kale and carrots is just not enough for people to live on. So what do? We subsidize the amount of money that farmers get for their crops. Their crop subsidies.
Yeah.
Farmers are living off, like, they'll sell their crops for 90 cents and the government will make up the dollar, the 10 cents different to get them to $1. So they're putting money into rural America, putting money in certain sectors of our economy to keep our farmers going. And your point about childcare is the one that the Biden administration is making, where he's like, look, we just need to do the same thing for childcare that we've been doing for farmers. Childcare workers don't make enough money, so then we can't run good childcare, and therefore people aren't comfortable putting their kids in childcare, and therefore it's slowing up people in the workforce. Let's pay childcare workers better, but not by taking it out of mom and dad's bank account when you have to pay your childcare, all of it, but the increase can come from the federal government to make up the difference, like we do with farmers.
Yeah.
So that's the argument. So what Fadhel is saying is, don't let fear of inflation stop you from spending the money that we need to spend in certain areas to make the economy work better for everybody. That's the argument. And I think it's an important one. This is where my analogy of the pool doesn't work, because the pool, all the water's in the pool, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more like it's a series of pools that are connected through a bunch of little waterfalls and little pipes. And there's a couple of dried up spots over on the right side of the yard, and all the water's over on the left. And what he's saying is, let's take some of the water that's over on the left and get it over onto the right. So the way you do that is to do government spending to the pools on the right side of the yard and take money out in taxes, so that there's not just too much money in there. That's why you're going to take some money out in taxes, which I still question whether it's necessary or not, but put the money in where it needs to be put in. And that makes all the pools have enough water. So what we should be doing with our federal spending is deciding where we're going to put the money. Take all of this way back to 2017 and 18, when the Republicans, who hold this same view, this is how the government works. Everyone knows in the federal government, this is how the government works. They don't talk about it. They don't always tell you. Their argument was, yeah, we need to make sure that some sectors of our economy have more money than they have right now. So we need to do something as a federal government to be sure that some people have more money than they have right now, because it's not good the way it is. So let's reduce the amount of taxes that we're taking from the wealthiest people in the country.
Yeah.
It's the
Different
same
solution to to the same problem.
But it's the same problem, right? And this is what Democrats and people who thought that was a bad idea should be arguing. Not tax the rich, to pay their fair share. It's you already have enough. We don't need to spend more government dollars functionally by not taking it from you. We just need to spend more dollars in the other place and don't even worry about you. Like we shouldn't even worry about their stupid little tax cut. Just spend the money in the places we need to spend the money. But what's happening for Democrats is we're getting rickrolled on both sides. The Republicans get to have a tax cut for the wealthiest people, and then they trick everybody into not spending more money on the other side of the pool, the pool on the other side of the yard. And it's this. So this is what Fadhel is arguing. He's arguing, don't worry about too much spending. We need to spend the money to make the economy more equal and more fair and more functional and more thriving. And actually his argument is spend the money in these programs, and then you don't have to spend the money in social service programs.
Right.
So, and this is the thing that Republicans argue all the time, like give people a job, don't give them a handout. Well, one of the ways you give people a job is by supporting the creation of those jobs at the federal level. And if you want an example of that, it's the American farm system. Right? We should just always come back in this argument to that thing that works for farmers. That's the thing we're talking about. Every time someone says, well, the government shouldn't pay someone to be a child care worker, or the government shouldn't be paying somebody to stay home, or the government shouldn't be paying money to somebody for doing nothing, then you say,
should the government pay farmers to burn fields of crops when we have too many crops? Like,
it's exactly what they do. And the answer is, yes, we should pay farmers to do that. And the answer is, yes, we should pay people to make the economy fair. This is where inflation and the economy come together into this thrilling moment of entertainment, inspiration, and education and information.
Well, we've got a minute 45 left in this. Should we?
Okay, yeah. Let's finish off. A minute 45 of Fadhel and then 14 minutes of ranting.
Most important, I think, and most neglected by the economics profession is what I call the abusive market power and price setting behavior of key players in the economy. Think of Big Pharma, think of the energy companies, think of companies that have high degrees of market concentration that allows them actually to set prices simply because they can, because there isn't enough competition, because consumers don't have a choice, and because federal regulators are not regulating them enough. In the US, we have things called antitrust laws, anti-monopoly laws. And if those laws are ineffective, then we have companies that actually can abuse their market power and control prices. Now, that type of inflation is not going to go away by spending less on the unemployed, by spending less on the pandemic, by spending less on education or infrastructure. It's got nothing to do with it. The only way to tame that risk of inflation from too much market power is to tax and regulate their market power out of existence. In other words, make those markets more competitive. Strengthen and apply antitrust laws the way they're supposed to be implemented to have a more competitive, more democratic economic system. So that becomes a question of political action. This is way outside the jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve Bank. The central bank is not in the business of regulating pharmaceutical companies or prices of energy companies and so on. This is in the hands of the 535 people we elect in Washington, D.C. We call them lawmakers. Their job is to regulate the market and to create a framework for a more competitive, more democratic system.
Okay, so here it is. Fadhel's saying the old argument is the government should spend less and regulate less. And Fadhel says, nope, the government should spend more, put it in the right places, distribute it differently, and should regulate more because the abusive market power and price setting behavior of certain industries is what will cause inflation.
Now, he used both the trigger words for Republicans, taxes and regulations. So.
And setting prices. Remember that? He's like setting prices. So this, and we do this, right? There's antitrust laws, as he mentioned, anti-monopoly laws. Even though we all as kids grew up playing the game Monopoly, and the goal was to get a monopoly, it's like, the goal at the economy level is for there not to be monopolies, because then they just drive up prices. And you see examples of this, right? Where you get certain prices in certain sectors that cause real harm to people because they've run the prices up. Some pharmaceutical companies, as you mentioned, have been doing that. And you might know people did this with some of the medication for people that are diabetics, right? Insulin
Yeah,
prices
insulin
went up.
is insane. Yeah.
Like, and one of the pharmaceutical companies also raised price on some other drug that was very common to people. It had been like $14 or something, and they raised it to $140. And the head of that company, pharmaceutical company, has gone to jail for price fixing and gouging and monopoly work. Like, it's illegal to do that. And what Fadhel is saying is that's how we're going to prevent inflation. Now, I would love to have, and lumber. You brought this up, Dan, too. You want to say something about the lumber question?
Yeah, lumber is an example of there was a demand issue, there's a supply issue, but then people hoarded the lumber, which jacked up the prices even more. So it was sort of an artificial inflation, and the only way to solve that is by the government saying, no, you have to sell your stockpile. Like, you're the bottleneck, you're creating the problem.
And it has economic impact, so it's more than just you in your own company.
Yeah.
That's so that's Fadhel makes a big deal about the abuse of market power and price setting behavior. And then Mike Dumfreen in the chat has a good point. He says, what information do we know in order to understand today's situation? Should we look at the practice of large corporations rather than government spending? So Mike's following this very, very, very accurately. He's saying, maybe it's corporations, because the new data shows that under an excuse of inflation, corporate profits have increased by 37%. Corporations raised prices and increased profits, the highest since 1950. And new data contradicts the widespread misconception that the stimulus package or government spending is where the bills are to blame. So yeah, I think Mike is onto it. And this is what Fadhel is saying is, look, it's not government spending. There's no indicator that that's the problem. The problem isn't that there's too much money. The problem is that the system can't push out the products in a timely fashion the way we want. But I will add this. They're now beginning to think that inflation is also related to the raise in prices that employers have to pay to employees. That partly because of the stimulus and partly because of people just sitting out work, people have said, like, I'm not going to work for $12 an hour.
Or $7.50 an hour. Yeah.
$7.50 an hour. We just had a friend send us a picture from a sign in his Kroger offering people to work there, and said, start working now. We need workers now at a Kroger grocery store. $17 an hour. But the final bullet point on the sign was, so it's like, flexible hours, work overnight, this kind of, and then the final one of 4 bullet points was, you have to be willing to cross a picket line. So what Kroger is saying is, we're having a staffing shortage because, here's that sign: full-time and part-time, minimum 18 years of age, no experience necessary, willing to cross a picket line. Go to the KrogerGrocery.com /careers. Because what they're finding at the Fred Meyer, like a lot of grocery stores, is people are going to start demanding to be paid more. Mike's point in tow. Corporations are making money, so we have to. Employees are saying, you have to pay us more.
Yeah,
that's at some point. It's not going to happen in a day, but at some point they're going to look at staff costs, and they're going to look at profits, and they're going to say, we're going to have to raise the price of items if we want to keep profits the way they are. Mike's point, Fadhel's point, I think, is, well, maybe corporations shouldn't be able to keep profits at 37%. That seems a little
right.
Well, whether or not the market forces can handle that. Now, I think the market forces can handle what corporations will do and how they'll price things and how much money they can make if it's a fair playing field. And this is Fadhel's point about abuse of market power and price setting behavior by corporations. We have to be careful that that's actually being regulated the way that it should. So what if there's 3 things: too much money in the economy, not enough product in the company, and price gouging and price fixing bad behavior by corporations? If those become the 3, which is the 1, 2, or 3, or in which order are these impacting our current inflation amounts? I would argue, Fadhel would argue, sounds like Mike would argue, Dan, let you argue for yourself, that it's too little product, then the behavior of corporations, and only after that, that there's too much money in the economy. So we shouldn't stop spending, Joe Manchin. We can keep spending just fine we can spend $1 trillion over the next 10 years into our economy and not cause inflation, where the pool isn't about to overflow.
Yeah. And if we're worried about spending money, we just passed like the biggest military spending budget of all time and didn't blink. Like if you want to cut back somewhere, maybe there's some room there to trim something.
If you got to drain some water out of the pools in our backyard, take one out of the military pool over there and put it over into the the pool on the right side. That's obviously an argument that can be made. I think the argument shouldn't be, we'll take it from the military and put it over into childcare. I think it should be put it into childcare, only because we don't have to take it. I don't even want to concede to these folks that their core argument is correct, that there's too much money in the economy. So if we're going to spend more, we have to take it from somewhere else. There's not too much in the economy. So even going down the route, which obviously we should, and your point is spot on, if you have to, then take it from the federal government, or take it from the military, don't not spend it. But that, we don't have to have that conversation.
Right.
There's plenty of room to spend money, to forgive. Look, you forgive student loan debt, and that's going to free up a whole lot of money in this economy. And one of the reasons they don't want to do that right now is they're afraid it's going to free up too much money in the economy, right? They think it's going to spread it out wrongly. So there's all kinds of political decisions being made about all of this. But I think for our conversations about common good politics and common good life in this country, and certainly common good economics, the government spending isn't the thing that should be blamed. If we're going to blame anything for this inflation, it's the pandemic and all the rest. And Fadhel goes on to say in his video that he thinks the only way we're going to get inflation under control is to get COVID under control. And I hope that's not the case, because that's not happening at a global level anytime soon.
Yeah, we're dropping that ball.
Wearing masks is a temporary action until the virus is no longer working through the system. The way the virus ends up not working through the system is that people's bodies are immune to it. The ways your body gets immune to it is either you contract the virus and your body builds its antibodies, or you preempt getting the virus for your body to produce the antibodies by having a vaccine. The vaccine is not happening fast enough. We're not going to control COVID internationally for the next 48 months, 24 months, somewhere in there. It's been 2 years, almost 2 years. It's going to be 2 more years before it gets under control, before vaccines are everywhere and variations and variants have settled down and all the rest of it. I mean, viruses are incredibly capable and smart at changing and reproducing. Our federal government not as smart at changing and reproducing, but the virus is, for its little task in the world. So we cannot say like, well, let's just get the virus under control and then inflation will come down. We got to stop inflation stuff right now. Just one other point here on this. What the Federal Reserve in the United States and all the other sovereign economies in the world want is they want inflation to be somewhere between 1% and 2%. That's where they don't want not inflation. They don't want it flatlining. Certainly don't want de-inflation. Mm-hmm. They want it at 1 or 2%. They don't want it at 3. They don't want it at 6. They want it at 1 or 2. They haven't been able to get it at 1 or 2. It's been flat for like years, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. It's been flat. Fadhel makes this point in the video a little later. He's like, I mean, we threw everything we could to try to make inflation happen to get it up to 1 or 2%, right? From 0. We want it up there. Couldn't get it. And then what caused it? The pandemic. So that tells you not our monetary decision, not our monetary practices. That's not what's going to control inflation, not diddle-dalling with the dials. It's availability of product. So that's the and we're not going to get the virus under control. So we have to have some other mechanism to control this, so we don't end up with 4 to 5% inflation for multiple months or years. That would be really, really bad. That would cause all kinds of all kinds of problem. Especially if people think the problem is too much money in the system. And then you go into what's called austerity, or when the government stops spending money they had budgeted to spend. That gets really bad. So not only are they not spending new money, they're not spending the money they planned to spend.
Yeah, like what happened in Greece a few years back.
Yeah, that's right. The whole thing collapsed. And across Europe that happened. Because their answer was stop spending money, and other countries were, no, the answer is spend more.
Increase
literally
capacity.
Do the opposite.
Yep.
So it's complex.
It is.
But
makes my head hurt
mean we can't
a little
talk
bit.
about it.
We need to be talking about it, though. Yeah.
This needs to stay free, and it is. But we would appreciate your donation, because you listened and you owe us money. So come on, Mike, send me $1. This is public radio. Also brought to you by Schlitz Brewery. It's having a holiday special. So go over and buy something over there. This is not a commercial.
This is not a commercial, but we're being paid to say what was written down.
Yeah. That's just really clever. Good for them. But you know what? People spend their money where they want to spend their money most of the time, if they have enough money to spend where they want, and if you want to spend your money there. And to all of those of you who do donate to the Life of O Common Good, we do desperately appreciate you. So thank you.
And if you're
for all your
concerned about
contributions.
inflation and think there's too much money in your pockets, send it our way. We'll take it out of the economy.
We'll make that money disappear. We'll make that money disappear in a minute. All right. Well, happy week, everybody. Happy Friday, Dan.
To you as well.
Enjoy your weekends. We'll see you for a holiday special next week.
All right.